it's weirdly one of these things where like the assumptions of the policing and prison system to some extent create the reality that they claimed already existed. It's like one learns to have a certain group identity and to be in conflict with other people by the prison system. And I'm not saying that that sensibility never exists without those systems, but it exacerbates them.
You're listening to Stories from the Inside Out, a podcast exploring the personal experiences of incarcerated individuals and those reintegrating back into society. We'll take a first-hand look at justice system involvement through conversations and interviews, as well as meet activists and stakeholders committed to changing the institutional status quo one step at a time. My name is Scott Kleik, and this is a Desta Black Community Network production. In this episode, we'll talk to Ted Rutland, activist, writer, and educator at Montreal's Concordia University, where he's actively involved in work around systemic racism, prisons, and other issues directly affecting the Black community. Ted sheds light on police misconduct and corruption, and how gang classifications in prisons impact and affect the lives of Black individuals moving through the Canadian justice system. This interview was conducted by Sam Reed, whose voice you will also hear in this episode.
So I'm Ted Rutland. I'm a teacher, a writer, and an activist. I teach at Concordia. I do a lot of teaching and writing around systemic racism, urban planning, housing, policing, and prisons. And I'm part of a collective called Anti-Carceral Group that does a lot of popular education around prison justice issues in Montreal, and also organizes protests to bring attention to the demands of incarcerated people. And I'm a member of the Defund the Police Coalition, which is a coalition of about 80 groups in Montreal seeking to defund the SPVM and reinvest that money in programs that actually help people and that make people safe. And when I moved to Montreal in 2010 to start teaching at Concordia, the movements that I was most inspired about were struggles against the police. Friday Villanueva, a Honduran youth, was killed by police in Montreal 2 years before I arrived. And I remember hearing about that in the media. And when I came to Montreal, I went to Montreal, went to some protests, met people. And here's the connection to gangs. It's like there was a group called Montreal République, which doesn't quite exist in that form, but is carried on in different ways, which are mostly Haitian and Lebanese activists from Montreal North. I learned from them that this category street gang was vastly exaggerated, that all kinds of Black, Latino, and Arab youth were getting classified as gangs, that the public could be scared by media headlines about gangs, that the police could constantly justify their brutal operations on the basis of repressing gangs, and that the reality is that there are very few actual gang members. Some of those who are involved in gangs are doing some kind of criminal stuff, which may or may not actually be a problem for the community. Some of what they're doing is a problem for the community, of course, but that it's way out of proportion. And so my researcher mind is like, well, I'd be interested in understanding where this category came from, because I feel like sometimes when you look at sort of taken for granted categories, in the moment that they start getting used, you can see quite obviously what they were for. There have been gangs in Montreal, like all large cities, going back to the early 1800s, especially, as industrialization begins in the mid-1800s, carries right into the present. Until the 1980s, those gangs were always composed of white people. They were often sort of marginalized white people from poor communities, sometimes from ethnically marginalized groups, Italians, Irish, French Canadian until the Quiet Revolution. And they could make a headline now and then, but there was never a gang squad. There was never a set of practices in prisons to classify people by gangs. And so it's only in the 1980s when black gangs start to be formed that there starts to be a major public concern about gangs. And now the first black gangs in Montreal were Haitian gangs, and they were formed as self-defense groups to fight against white racists in general and white gangs in particular. And so the first Haitian street gang in Montreal was called Les Bélangers. It was formed in Saint-Michel. And, it's hard to name when they were formed because they were a group of friends. So they were a group of friends who met in elementary school, and at some point they sort of took up the idea that they were a gang. That would be the late 70s. And I'm co-authoring a book on this gang with the former leader of this gang, Maxime Orlien. And, what he and his friends, and also older Haitians in that time, talk about is that they were assaulted and attacked everywhere in the city. That this was, in some ways, an explicitly racially segregated city. Like, there were many bars and restaurants with a sign that said, pas de noir, or something worse. Or it's just like, that if you go there, you're going to get beat up. And that includes the metro system. That includes any of the bars downtown. Basically, what Maxime tells me is, his parents, that first wave of Haitian migrants, were kind of okay sticking around their neighborhood and, hanging out in a few institutions in the area and in people's backyards and people's basements. And so they didn't necessarily face that kind of attack. But for the younger generation who wanted to claim this city as theirs, they faced violence at every turn. And so they banded together and sort of made a pact at one point that if they were attacked, they'd fight back. And that was all they did for a while. And they helped to form another gang in Montreal North because they kept going to the defense of Haitians in Montreal North. And they're like, why don't you form your own gang? So the second gang was called Master B. And it's only with the creation of these gangs, which can be viewed as violent criminal organizations, that we have media headlines about it, and that the police start waging a quiet war on gangs at first, and then create the first anti-street gang squad in 1989. And it's ironic, right, to see them as violent when the violence was really coming from white people, but that violence wasn't considered violence. And you've interviewed El Jones, like anyone who really thinks about it and understands this, that like white violence is tolerated and black violence is like a social crisis, even when that violence is self-defense. And what the policing of street gangs did is that the police had an idea that these gangs were all necessarily in conflict, which they weren't actually. They would play off perceived conflicts and create them. So they would tell someone in one gang that someone from the other gang is sleeping with their girlfriend. Or they'd spread lies about some people being informers. So they exacerbated conflicts. The repression was so strong that there's a real cost to being associated with the gang. So any youth who's not willing to go to prison leaves. And what that did with Les Bélangers, for example, is it left the gang in the control of people who are more willing to go to prison, and including one person who really wanted to make the gang into basically like the mafia, like some high, just like 18 or whatever, and he wants to be Michael Corleone, seriously. And he became one of the most important street gang leaders in Montreal. So it created and exacerbated conflicts between gangs, and it pushed them towards more explicit criminality. During the so-called crack crisis in Little Burgundy in 89, 90, 91, they had one of the worst neighborhood police departments maybe in the last 40 or 50 years, like extremely corrupt, extremely violent. They had one crack dealer that they were in business with, and so they would bust one cracker operation, give the drugs to another. They would just pick somebody off the street and drive them around the neighborhood, with the understanding that now everyone's going to think that they're a rat. So you're putting that person's life in danger. So they do that. They plant drugs on people. They steal people's drugs. I mean, people that I know who are part of sex worker organizations, the police are constantly robbing drug dealers and sex workers. Every time I see a newspaper article about a drug bust where they seized like 10 kilograms of cocaine and no cash, I'm like, wow, somebody went out for a nice dinner last night. But, there will never be an expose of this because, I've interviewed police officers for this book that I'm trying to do, and they will tell you, it's like, if you bust a drug dealer for 10 kilos and like $100,000 cash, and you pocket $100,000 cash and 5 kilos, and you bust them for 5 kilos, the drug dealer's not going to argue with you because they get a lesser sentence. And so it works for both of them. And I'm not going to, say that all cops are doing this at all. I think that we don't really know the extent to which this happens for the reasons I'm saying. Is like there's no incentive for the people who are harmed by it to denounce it because they'll end up going to prison longer. And then some people who could denounce it are just, they are involved in criminality like a sex worker or a drug dealer. So
their hands are tied.
So yeah. And I don't think our society gives them the respect that they deserve. So they can speak out about it all they want, but it's not going to really make a difference. Around 1990, 1991, they started sending different gangs to different sectors of different prisons, and then eventually different prisons entirely. The decision that we're going to assume that certain kinds of gangs are necessarily in conflict actually creates conflicts both behind bars and into the city. Like, people learn things in prison, and if you go to prison and all of a sudden you're hanging out with a bunch of people because you're assumed to be friends and you're assumed to be the enemies of those people, you might take on that sensibility. And the other thing, of course, is that, lots of people are classified as gang members and as part of a certain gang formation when they're not. And so it's weirdly one of these things where, like, the assumptions of the policing and prison system to some extent create the reality that they claimed already existed. It's like, one learns to have a certain group identity and to be in conflict with other people by the prison system. And I'm not saying that sensibility never exists without those systems, but it exacerbates them. We have a policing and prison system where we use the police in prison to address every possible social problem. It is our dominant solution to poverty. We're not actually interested in providing a decent living to everyone or decent housing to everyone. And so we police people who are poor and manage to get an income through illegal means. And then people go to prison. And if they're not going to end up in a better situation when they leave, and it's rare that they would because their actual conditions haven't changed and now they have a criminal record, they're going to learn in prison maybe some new skills. And I'm not actually opposed to that because we don't give them any other way of surviving. But if our goal is to reduce violence, and if some of that violence is perceived to be gang violence, then we're actually doing the opposite of what we should be doing because we're instructing whole generations of people to identify with a gang and to be in conflict with other gangs when they might otherwise not have it all. And so they leave prison in a worse situation than before. Hopefully they meet DESTA, and DESTA can sort of support them to make other choices, but DESTA can't help everybody. And so some people are going to get involved in crime that maybe involves a little bit more violence than before, which the system is supposed to be, is justified on the grounds of diminishing, but it actually increases.
I do want to talk about the classifications within the prisons. How do these classifications harm people that are inside right now or that are going through the system? And how do they use that against them?
I think there are a bunch of ways that gang classifications can harm people. And I'll just maybe mention a couple of them. First of all, it limits where you can be transferred to. Okay, so if you're potentially moving down a level from maximum to medium or medium to minimum, there might not be a place available for you in a prison of that classification that is deemed to be appropriate for you with your gang classification. So you can be cleared to move down to medium, say, and you can end up remaining in max for a year, for longer, because we can't move you to that prison because that prison is a blue gang. So I'm not sure whether these are the only classifications in all of Quebec, but they're the two classifications that are most operative in Montreal. So the two categories are blue and red. And there was, some reality to those classifications at a point in time where gangs in Montreal Nord and in the eastern parts of the city had some kind of vague alliance, and gangs from Saint Michel, and sometimes heading into the southwest and west of the city. So maybe Burgundy, maybe Côte d'Arneige and NDG might have had some kind of vague alliance. And that is the set of classifications that got imposed within the prison system. And so you're kind of either red or you're blue.
And that's just based on where you live, basically.
Well, that's it, isn't it? I mean, it should be based on the gang that you're part of, but most of the people that are getting gang affiliations aren't patched up members of like a certain kind of gang. And so it really is where you're from in the city. It does a lot of harm. It's really hard to see what good it does. There are conflicts in prisons. And if we're not willing to actually address the root causes of those harms, then I suppose the best we can do is to identify people who might be in conflict and keep them apart. But if you're actually interested in addressing conflicts, which to me would be kind of important given that almost everybody in prison is going to be out at some point, many of them very soon, like most people in prison aren't going there for very long. We would want to be addressing the causes of conflict rather than exacerbating them. And that's what the classifications do, is they make them worse while seeming potentially to address the problem in the short term. And so people who had nothing to do with any kind of gang, just because of where they're from and because they're black, are getting gang classifications. Another thing that it does is the prison system assumes that you're in relationship with other people who have the same gang classification as you. And so you see people who like aren't part of a gang, or they've been in prison a long time and they were part of a gang like 20 years ago, but they aren't now, are getting punished for collaborating with the illegal behavior of someone else who they may not even really be in contact with. If you're seen talking with someone, it might seem that you're organizing something so you can be implicated in something that someone else does. Outside the prison system, the idea of a gang will increase the criminalization of black people and to a lesser extent Latinos and Arabs. It will cause people who fall into those categories to be stopped when they've done nothing wrong, and it'll cause them to be arrested for things when they do something wrong, do something illegal, that a white person would never get stopped or arrested for. So it increases the criminalization of people outside the system, both by criminalizing people who were never involved in anything, increasing the chances that someone will get caught if they are involved in something, potentially increasing the chance of conviction and the length of their sentence if they actually get convicted of something. And then inside the prison system, it does the same thing, where it increases the chance that you'll get caught for something that you did, and it'll increase the chances that you'll get punished for something that someone who maybe you knew, but maybe you didn't even know did, because you're assumed to be in relationship with them.
I know that a lot of folks are trying to have their gang affiliation removed because of the injustice that they're facing. So do you have any information on that you could share?
You know, I don't have advice on how to have them removed. I know the process is really difficult, and I'm glad that there are people inside fighting for this and people outside supporting them. But absolutely, I mean, it's detrimental to people's lives. It's detrimental to our entire society because it contributes to the kind of problems that we believe that we're trying to combat with the prison system. And so it would make the prison system slightly less bad if we could actually deal with the conflicts that exist within prisons, which they do exist, instead of pretending that these classifications help us to manage potential conflicts, when what they really do is exacerbate conflicts and increase the sort of limitations on people who've been given a gang label and put them under heightened surveillance and heightened possibility of punishment, moving up a level in the level of security rather than down. It's just incredibly detrimental.
I just want to go back to the classifications and inside. Even being removed, like if they're using that, like you said, to transfer them to like outside of the city or in a different province even sometimes, how upon reentry you're talking about also like the lack of support there is to prepare them for reintegration. Do you feel like changing them from maybe where they're comfortable, where they're from, then being re-released in like say Nova Scotia, for example, or in Quebec City or something like that? Like, can you speak about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think that if people want to be released into a different community than the one they're from, then we should support them, and they should make that happen. Like, I know people, as you do too, I'm sure, who have been released from prison and they want to remake their life, and that for them seems easier if they're somewhere where their old friends are not around. And so if people want to do that, they should be supported in doing it. But forcing people to be released into a community where they don't know anyone, I mean, it just defies common sense, right? Like, luckily, there are organizations like DESTA that do an important job. But again, DESTA can't reach everyone. And also the conditions that people are released into are just too difficult for any organization to really help them through. And so you need community. You need people who can like lend you a bit of money or can help you find an apartment or who know somebody who can give you a job, because we know that like a lot of jobs come through connections, through word of mouth. And so it seems like another layer of punishment to send someone to a totally different community. And I'm just talking about like straight up economics, you know, whether they can get housing, get a job, how it feels for people to have to completely rebuild their social life and their community from scratch is another level of that. So it's extremely harmful. I mean, if you really wanted to design a system that continually cycles people from the prison back into the community and then back into prison, this is pretty much the system that you would design. I mean, I just keep coming back to the fact that, like, until 1989, there was no street gang squad. A street gang squad has been a constant part of Montreal policing ever since. So we have police officers whose job it is to just go after street gangs, and we know what they imagine a street gang member to look like. It's going to be a black person primarily, maybe a Latino or Arab person. So, you know, if we talk about racial profiling, blah, 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 it's like, we can try to fight racial profiling all we want, but if you're part of the street gang squad, I mean, your job is to racial profile. And if you ask somebody like, oh, what's the problem with street gangs? It's like, oh, violence. It's like, okay, well, you know what? Violence exists in every community. If we want to talk about violence, we should. But that's not a racial thing. And that's not a street gang thing. That's like a social issue that we have since we've been living in societies as human beings. You know, and in French, the term gang de rue was invented in 1989. Before that, they were called bandes. They basically invented a new word to talk about black gangs. For 150 years, they just used the word bande. And then in 1989, when they wanted to go after Haitian gangs, they translated the English word street gang into gang de rue, made gang into a feminine in French, because the word is usually masculine, but like street gang is la gang, my gang. They invented a whole new word. And they do this in response to black efforts for liberation and self-defense. Because alongside these gangs that were defending the black community from white racists, there was a really strong movement against police racism and violence through the 80s. And the police respond by saying, the problem isn't racist cops, it's criminal black people. And they do this every time. They did it with the most recent Black Lives Matter uprising. For about 3 months, we were talking about defunding the police. And now the police and the police brotherhood and much of the media have managed to convince Montrealers that our biggest problem is like youth with guns, black youth with guns, and street gangs. And it's amazing. Yeah. They manufactured a bunch of data about gun violence to make it seem like it was an unprecedented problem. When you actually look at the figures, it's like, yeah, there's violence and there are murders. You know, it's a problem. We should want a city with no murderers, but they're blowing it way out of proportion, and they're making all violence a question of an issue caused by a few marginalized youth in the northeast of the city. It's like, if we think about it for 5 seconds, we know that violence is extremely widespread and it's in all communities. We've sort of forgotten that there was a wave of mostly white men killing their partners. So we know that violence isn't a racial thing.
Thanks for listening to the show. We appreciate your time and attention. Please subscribe to Stories from the Inside Out and leave us a rating or review wherever you get your podcasts. You can follow DESTA BYN on Instagram to stay up to date about the show, or visit destabyn.org to learn more about our reentry program, the Black Legal Action Fund, and other DESTA Black Community Network programs. Until next time, take care.